From the role-playing perspective, from the RPG perspective, what makes for an all-rounded, effective adventuring party? That's what we're going to explore in this vlog, and we're going to break out. We're going to pull it away from any specific system. We're going to try and look at the architecture and say this is usable for GURPS, or this is usable for Rollmaster, for D&D, looking at the idea of defeating any of the challenges thrown by the adventurer or the game master, monster encounters or sci-fi encounters. Ideally, the idea behind an adventuring party is that you are working literally as a team, kind of a mini army on the table. All of the advantages you're bringing forward, and any disadvantages in the gaming system, you have an answer for that. You're spreading them over multiple player characters. So this way, what we see is if we have a party of 4 to 6 players, at various times during an encounter or at various times of just interaction making skill checks, not everything's going to be in play. A perfect example is if you have a well-balanced party, and as a dungeon master, I'm able to charm. I'm able to reach out, charm person, and take control of the paladin. You have redundancy, you have other things backed up so that your primary frontline fighter, your sword and board, your damage attack dealing dice is not fully eliminated. So we want to specialize, but we also want to build in redundancy. Now, I will say this is kind of approaching things from a very meta perspective. Obviously, you can have an unbalanced adventuring party and have a great time. I ran a campaign. I always believe take the narrative first, rules second. But I realize there's different approaches to RPGs and various games. I ran an adventure in D&D. It was 4 or 5 adventures, kind of a mini campaign, taking the players from level 1 to level 4 to prove their worthiness as an apprentice to various wizards in the Wizards Guild. So it was a party of first level wizards. They had to figure it out. I'm leveraging that. So what we want to explore is this idea, breaking it out in the architecture. Look at the various phases of the game. The various phases of the game, both inside and outside of an encounter, and make sure you have a primary and ideally a secondary for each of these phases. Perfect example. Dungeons and Dragons, magic phase. We have arcane, the ability to utilize magic. We have arcane and we have divine. Do you have access, ideally, to both of those phases? Now, this could be an example. The divine could be through a cleric, could also be through a druid. Divine access could be primary cleric, secondary paladin. Or it could be secondary, you don't have a cleric, but secondary paladin. Not as ideal, but if we're building that column, if we're building that checklist, you've got something there. Same thing, of course, with arcane. If it's a wizard, if it's a warlock, if it's a sorcerer, and some of the sub-aspects in there. Fighting, frontline fighters, and not just a fighter class or a warrior class. Who are your frontline fighters? Who are your secondary fighters? Who's the rogue/scout in the party? So looking at these phases, building your list. The same goes for skill checks. If we're going to interact with NPCs and we're going to try to bluff or we're going to try to intimidate, who has the highest bonus? Who has the skill checks? Who has the power card, whatever system we're playing, to be able to begin to explore it? This is the ideal. And if you build a party out, often what we see when we're playing a role-playing system, and I pushed this idea up to my archive here, the channel, this idea of session 0, where you sit down as the players, the DM, GM gives you background. This is the campaign. This is common knowledge in the world. And the players discuss and say, well, who wants to play a fighter? Maybe we should have primary fighter. Who wants to play secondary? I'll play a monk. It's not a frontline fighter, but now we've got the primary and the secondary covered. Well, do we want to bring in arcane? Who's going to handle that? It's a great way to kind of discuss and formulate out and build this checklist. We can go all extreme, all in on the meta, or on the opposite side, you could play a narrative party, all fighters, all rogues, all wizards, just being aware of that interplay.